What is up, guys? Today I'm working on my 80 series Land Cruiser and I'm replacing my front wheel stud. These tend to break off over time, especially when they're over tightened, which is what happened to mine. I'm going to show you everything you need to do for this repair, along with some tips and tricks that I learned along the way. I hope this video can save you some time and some money and gets your 80 series back on the road. These are the tools that you're going to need. I'll list them in the description below, along with links on where to purchase them. Throughout the video, you'll notice I'll be referencing this diagram, which includes everything that the factory service manual has regarding the front axle on the 80 series Land Cruiser. It was super handy for this repair. For those of you that have been around the 80 series community long enough, you'll remember that there used to be a site where we can purchase one very similar to this and a bunch of other really awesome Land Cruiser parts. Unfortunately, they're no longer in business, so I decided to make my own. The replacement of the wheel stud is actually pretty straightforward. You use a pin punch or a brass drift and a big hammer to pop it out, and then the replacement stud, the stud tool, or a bunch of washers, and I'm going to use an impact wrench. Now, the correct way, the Toyota way to do this, is to have it pressed in using a press. Now, if you have access to a press, definitely use that. However, I'm going to use this stud tool that I found on Amazon. You could even use the same wheel to press it in. So although the process is pretty straightforward, you'll still need to access the disc rotor and the hub sub-assembly and separate the two in order to press the wheel stud through. So now I'm going to show you how to do that. With the car on jack stands and the tire removed, turn the steering wheel to access the caliper. Open the brake reservoir and cover it so no dust or debris gets on it. You'll want to be careful not to damage the brake line while working in here. Using a 17mm socket, remove the two bolts that attach the brake caliper. I had to use a breaker bar for this. Tie off the caliper to the side and don't let the brake line hang to prevent damage. Remove the dust cap with a flathead screwdriver and a hammer by slowly prying it out. To remove the snap ring, I used a hook and a flathead screwdriver to pry it out and a set of pliers to remove it. If you have snap ring pliers, use those. With a 12mm socket, remove the 6 flange nuts and washers from the hub flange. Hammer out the cone nuts till they pop out and remove the flange. Remove the flange gasket.
There should be a gasket right here.
This one is actually stuck on here and you'll want to replace this. Clean out the grease so you can get a good view of the lock nut. Unbend the lock washer tab using a flathead screwdriver and a hammer. Remove the lock nut with a 54mm socket, or if you're in a pinch like me, use a flathead and a hammer. Toyota recommends using the 54mm socket as you're going to need to torque this down later. Remove the lock washer. Remove the adjusting nut with a 54mm socket. I'm using a flathead and a hammer. Remove the thrust washer. This should come off pretty easily. The outer bearing will come out, so set it aside. We're going to clean it up and re-grease it. While I'm in here, I like to keep things clean, so I'm going to remove the grease from the knuckle spindle. With the rotor and the hub sub assembly removed, I'm going to spray the stud with some WD-40 or PB Blaster, and I'll let that penetrate for a bit. Now with a long pin punch or a brass drift, hammer out the old stud until it comes loose. Now I'm going to use an impact wrench to separate the 17mm bolts that separate the rotor from the hub sub-assembly. I'm going to use a screwdriver and a hammer to separate the rotor from the hub sub-assembly. Finish hammering out the old stud. Now we're going to clean the hub sub-assembly, spray it down with some brake cleaner. Now we're going to place the new stud. We want to ensure the stud is nice and lined up flush with the hub. Now we'll use our stud tool and our lug nut. I'm going to use an impact wrench to push the stud through. You want to make sure it's nice and straight, and you don't want to overdo it. You'll notice I'm checking to make sure it's nice and lined up before I use my tool. I want to make sure that when I use my impact, it pushes it through nice and straight. During this process, I wasn't pushing down on the trigger all the way. I was making sure it was nice and slow, and I was checking to make sure I hadn't over tightened it. And once I confirmed it was nice and flush with the hub, I stopped. I gave it a few looks to make sure it wasn't crooked, and it looked good. And again, Toyota recommends using a press for this, but a lot of guys just use a stud tool or a bunch of stacked washers. And if you have a press or access to a press, just go ahead and do that. It's much better. While we're in here, it's good to check the old bearings to make sure they're in good shape. I'm also going to remove the old grease from the hub and clean it so we can add some new high temp bearing grease. You might not want to do this because it adds a little bit more time in the repair, but if you're already in here, you might as well add some new grease, especially if it hasn't been done in a while. well. I replaced my rotors and pads while I was in here because of all the work involved. I have a video on my channel. Now it's time for reassembly. Add some Loctite to the 17mm hub bolts and tighten them back up using a crisscross pattern. And we're going to tighten these to 47 foot-pounds using a torque wrench. Using some high temp bearing grease, we're going to pack the hub with grease just like it was before. The goal here is to coat the inside of the hub along with the oil seal and bearings. Before I install this, I'm going to clean the rotor with brake cleaner to remove any excess grease. I'm going to add some high temp grease around the area where the outer bearing will sit. I'm going to be rebuilding my entire front axle soon, so I won't be replacing any bearings just yet. But if you're not planning on rebuilding yours, this might be a good time to replace some bearings if they look a little worn. I'm going to clean up these bearings and pack them up with grease. To pack these with grease, you'll just want to make sure they're coated with grease and that the grease comes out of the other side to ensure they are fully coated. Place the outer bearing. Now the thrust washer. The adjusting nut. You'll notice I'm using a flathead screwdriver and a hammer. However, Toyota recommends torquing it down to 43 foot-pounds, moving the hub back and forth to ensure the bearing seats properly, then loosening it up again, and then tightening it up again to 4 foot-pounds. Second Gear Low has a great video on this, so check him out. Here's how he did it. Now the lock washer. This is a non-reusable part, but I'll replace it when I rebuild my front axle. Now the lock nut using a 54mm, and we're going to torque this down to 47 foot-pounds. You'll notice I'm using a flathead screwdriver and a hammer. However, Toyota recommends using a 54mm socket and using a torque wrench to torque it down to 47 foot-pounds. We're going to fold the tabs on the lock washer to keep the lock nut in place. Add some high temp bearing grease again.
On this one, remember there is a gasket here, so you'll want to clean this off completely before you put it back on. I'm going to just reuse my gasket because I'm going to tear it apart again when I rebuild my front axle in a couple weeks. But otherwise, you get that gasket and put it on.
Now we place the hub flange. To tighten it back up, we're going to use the cone washer, and the flange nut, and we're going to torque this down to 26 foot-pounds. With some snap ring pliers, put the snap ring back on. This might be quite challenging because the axle shaft will want to keep moving back and forth, so I'm using a spare bolt to keep it from moving. This process was a bit tedious as the snap ring was not wanting to cooperate. I ended up hammering the brass ends on the snap ring pliers to create a small ledge, which allowed me to open the snap ring and slip it over the axle shaft without it flying across the garage. And now we're going to install the caliper back. We're going to put some thread locker on the 17mm caliper bolts, and we're going to tighten those down to 90 foot-pounds. And finally, we're going to hammer the dust cap back on. But that was it for the video today, guys. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this video was helpful. I hope it helps you in your journey to restoring your Land Cruiser back to its original shape. And if you guys are interested in one of these 80 series Land Cruiser front axle reference diagrams, please let me know in the comments below. You guys have a good one.